Slip casting techniques using mask latex. Today we're going to show some slip casting techniques you can use with dry hydrocal, plaster, or ultracal 30 molds to cast rubber masks and latex props with a foam filling. Now the first thing you'll need is a dry mold, and this is imperative. This is a hydrocal mold that we have here of a face, and you notice that we have a flat side on it, and that's important because whatever type of mold you make is going to need to sit level or sit in such a way that can function like a bowl during the dwell time or the dwell stage of the casting process. So you need a good dry mold that's free of any kind of mold release or residue that will keep the latex from curing. And next we'll be using our mask latex for our casting. The mask latex is just a pourable formula of latex that's just a neutral color, and if you need to pigment it more of a flesh tone, you can always add acrylic paints to that to color it. Now the first thing we'll need to do is fill our mold with latex. And since this mold has a little bit of detail, what we're going to do is a technique we typically do for something with a lot more detail, and that is just use a chip brush to get in there and brush the latex into any of the detailed areas. And you don't want to wait too long for this, because the longer you wait, the latex will start to cure where it's coming in contact with the plaster. So you want to immediately get in there and brush the latex into all of the detail, and then fill up the mold the rest of the way. And this is a crucial step, because if you have a piece that has a lot of fine surface details, that'll help push those bubbles out of those voids and make sure that you have a bubble-free surface. And now, once we brush the surface, we're ready to fill up the mold the rest of the way. Now that we've filled up our mold with latex, we're ready for our dwell time. Now this stage is crucial to building up a thickness of latex in the mold. If we dumped it right back out now, we'd have a very thin membrane of latex on the surface. So in order to build up a nice thickness, we're going to let this dwell in the mold for about 30 minutes. So I always like to have a timer sitting by to make sure that I don't leave it too long. But the longer you leave it, that will build up a thicker and thicker skin. Now, once we've reached the end of our dwell time, we're ready to pour out the latex that hasn't congealed on the sides of the mold. Now, the 30-minute dwell time, that's just a serving suggestion there. That's actually going to wind up with a relatively thin mask thickness. If you're doing really thick professional, like collector's masks, you might want to have a dwell time of an hour or even 2 hours. But either way, once you're done with that stage, you're ready to pour out the remaining latex. A couple ways you can do that: either back into the jug, which is a little tricky, or you can have a gallon pail with a wide mouth like this to reclaim that latex out of the mold. But it's real important that you dump all of that latex residue out so that it doesn't pool in some of the low points of the mold and take a long time to dry. That, if you have little pooled areas of latex, you're going to wind up with areas like the nose or the chin taking a long time to completely dry. Now, as latex dries, it will darken and start to pull away from the mold as it shrinks away from the surrounding mold. And the drier the mold is, the faster that process takes place. We let this sit overnight for it to completely dry and begin to cure and pull away from the mold. Now, before we pull this out, for a lot of parts that are going to be props and display masks and things like that, a lot of people like to use a foam backing. So here we're mixing up some of our F3 flexible foam. And it's important that we pour the foam before we try to demold that skin. If we were to peel that latex skin out and then try to put it back into the mold and pour that foam, we might wind up with a lot of distortions on the surface of the skin. So it's important that you let that sit and use one of the flexible foams, because one of the reasons we're using flexible foam, of course, is so that this can compress to demold out of any undercut areas. So now, once that foam completely cures, F3 and most of our flexible foams cure to where they have handling strength in about 30 minutes. It's always a good idea, though, to wait a good hour or so if you have a complicated part that you need to demold, to make sure that you don't distort the piece in the process of demolding it. Now, you'll notice we're carefully breaking away the latex from the surrounding parts of the mold there before we pull that out. And there we have our finished slip latex part cast into a hydrocal mold. And one of the important things to remember when you're casting with mask latex and using the slip casting method is it is super important to have a dry plaster mold. If your mold is too damp, it will not do the dwell process properly. So make sure you have a good dry mold to work with that's made of either hydrocal, pottery plaster, or UltraCal 30. And of course, you can find mask latex along with other molding supplies such as hydrocal and other special effects supplies on our web store at brickintheyard.com.